Russia's won this war, and Russia is not going to back down from that. Why would they? I wouldn't. It just, if we had won something, we wouldn't back down from it either. So the bottom line is that's what no one wants to do. And if Donald Trump does it, and I think eventually he'll be compelled to do it, although instead of doing it, I predict what we'll probably see happen is that the media will be told by the CIA and MI6 and everything else, just don't talk about this anymore. Focus elsewhere. And we'll give them a new war in the Middle East. Only the new war in the Middle East will be as bad, if not worse, than what we've seen already in eastern Ukraine. And we are not going to be on the winning side on that one either. But that's preferable to admitting disaster. I mean, don't you remember how Jimmy Carter and, for that matter, Gerald Ford all stood up and said, we failed miserably in Vietnam. It was a tragedy. It was a disaster. We should never have done it. Don't you remember when they made those statements? No, they never made those statements.
Yeah.
They said, oh, we may have killed 250,000 or 300,000 Vietnamese. My God, we killed at least 2 million, I suspect, based on the numbers that I've seen. No one would admit it. Today, we talk about it, but there was never a willingness at the time to be truthful. Disraeli said that the rarest commodity in politics is courage. Boy, was he right. There's no one with courage to admit anything. And the sad part is that for President Trump, this is a simple issue. You simply stand there and you say, look, I didn't start this. I didn't want this, and I want to end it. I'm going to take steps to do that, whatever is required, because this is something we don't want to be part of anymore. And we don't want a war with Russia. Kling, he wins. He wins.
I think a lot of people would support that. I mean,
he wins from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine. That's a winning hand. Instead of this nonsense, according to Sebastian Gorka, man about town, if you don't do what we say, well, then he'll deliver more aid than he's ever delivered. Yeah, and who's going to pick it up and use it? Is he going to address a room full of dead and skeletons? Talk to the cemeteries, tell them to get up, and here's the equipment you want. And you hear this crap of, it's our fault they're in this position. We should have let them do anything they wanted to begin with. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. It was always a disaster. This was always a no-winner. And the only solution when you have failed in a proxy war is to jump in and fight it yourself. It's the only solution. And you know what, Dan? We're not going to do that. Neither is Mr. Rutte or his predecessor Stoltenberg. Forget it. They're not going to show up.
Yeah, or Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron, when it comes down to it, I don't think that they're going to shovel their own troops into that. I don't think either one of them politically could survive, not to mention the fact it's immoral. What do you think, Doug, and let's look at a different aspect of this, the Ukrainian people, what is your guess as to when all this plays out, as it necessarily will? It just has to. The war has long been decided. It just is still be going on to find out what the final loss tally is going to be on the Ukraine side. But once it finally happens, it seems that even the government media campaigns and whatnot that have been flooding the Ukraine zone all the way through about, we're going to win, we're going to drive them back to the 1991 borders, all this stuff, when all of it's exposed as being a sham. What do the people think? Do they feel, or are they going to feel like they've been betrayed by their people, betrayed by the West? Are they going to think that, oh no, you guys just didn't do enough and then we would have won? How do you think that's going to play out on the ground?
My impression from the feedback I get from Ukraine, people on the ground there, is the population is exhausted and wants this to end. And they're quite prepared to cede territory in eastern Ukraine that most of them always knew was Russian anyway. This is the problem. When Brzezinski was still alive in the 1990s, he approached Bill Clinton and he brought up the issue of Ukraine. And he specifically said, Ukraine is a disaster waiting to happen because eastern Ukraine is Russified. And we've got to come to terms with that. If we don't, there will be a war down the line. So we need to redraw the map, rearrange the borders. Well, there was no will to do it in the 1990s. Bill Clinton didn't care about it. And so where are we today? We're exactly where we are, according to what you've got on the screen. We're telling them, recruit more people to die. For what? And the Ukrainians are saying, no, we don't want it. And I'm sure that's true. Now, having said all of that, and having grown up with people from Western Ukraine, they will never change their minds and their attitudes about the Russians. And the sad part is that they confuse being a Russian with being a communist. This is part of the problem. They're living with the nightmare of the 1920s and 30s, when the Bolsheviks murdered millions of people, millions of Ukrainians, raped them, brutalized them, deported them, and shot them, and starved them to death. That has never gone away. It never would. That's one of the reasons why, when the Wehrmacht reached Eastern Europe and moved in, they were greeted almost virtually everywhere, even in White Russia, and even by many Russians, as a liberating force. That was a missed opportunity. That could have been the end of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, would have saved everybody a great deal of grief. Unfortunately, the people at the top, Adolf Hitler in particular, wouldn't adapt to reality. So the problem is that more lives were lost, at least 39 million, contrary to what the Russians say. And here we sit. We're dealing with the legacy of this nightmare, this tragedy. They need to come to terms with the reality that that is, in fact, over. And they've got to live in a new world now. And that new world doesn't have to bear any resemblance to that horror that they experienced in the past. Now, how do we do that? I don't know, but it doesn't matter when the borders are drawn. And, the simple truth is, if you go back and look through the maps through hundreds of years, you go to the top of the map where the border of Ukraine meets Belarus, and you follow the Dnieper River south. Just follow that line south, okay? Eventually, what you get is a line that goes all the way down to where Crimea is. And that line for that river has historically been, for most of the last 1,000 years, the border of the West. Everything to the east was Russian, Mongolian, Tartar, and Turkic. Everything to the west was considered European. Maybe not Central European, but European. And here we are. What is the line that we're drawing? The Russians are only drawing a line along those areas that were part of what was called Novorussia under Catherine the Great. When Catherine the Great sent her armies down there to throw the Tartars and the Mongols out, there were very few people living there. If you go to Mariupol was founded in about 1805 or 1807. And as I recollect, they were founded by Germans or Englishmen that had been brought in to start these cities by the Tsarina. And then they began gathering Eastern Slavs, either from Ukraine or Russia, in to populate, because those areas hadn't been developed. The Ottomans never did anything with it. And so what you get today is this sort of crazy notion that Ukraine is this nation state that has withstood all sorts of problems for 1,000 years. It's not true. It's a region. It's an area. And the people that live there are not the same today as they were 800 years ago or even 300 years ago, thanks to tragedy after tragedy. We don't understand all of this. We don't have the answers to it, which is why we have no business being involved in it.
Right. Yeah. And the people who live there have a hard enough time it is, but all we can do is just exacerbate it. Well, we'll have to hope that when President Trump gets in, that he'll do any version of the things that you recommend, because that certainly would be the best way to put a cap on something really ugly and prevent it from getting any further.